Yo guys, I've got a spark which I'm going to use to ignite the fire for a brand new #Film Friday here on my channel, only that this is coming out on a Monday, and that's because I'm doing a double bill for this series based on the fact that these projects have been delayed for weeks now. So we have the Pixar ranking today on Monday, and then on Friday to conclude the week we're going to have the Triple Deluxe review, which I've been promising for a while now. So that being said, the Pixar catalogue is huge. At this point we have 27 films to rank, all of which I like them at least to a certain extent. Even the films at the very bottom of Pixar's ranking, because even when Pixar are at their worst, they are still producing some visually gorgeous films with heart and a important message behind them. So that being said, I haven't done a Pixar ranking since Soul first came out, and since that movie came out, Turning Red, Lightyear and Elemental have released, so it's time to incorporate those three films into ranking, and I'm choosing to release this now whilst Elemental is still at least relatively new. So now that that's been said and done, let's get into the ranking list without further ado. At the very bottom slot, for number 27, I have the exact same film that a majority of people who rank all the Pixar films would also put at the very bottom slot, that being Cars 2, which is an absolute stain on Pixar's almost perfect record. This film suffers from its target audience, that being it's a film made for kids and kids alone. There is no deeper meaning to be found in this film, and it shouldn't even be a Cars film to begin with. This generic and predictable espionage film doesn't really take advantage of being set in a world with sentient vehicles. The exact same plot could have been done with humans and nothing would change. Even more unfortunate is the fact that this is the main plotline, and it takes away from a far more interesting and appropriate subplot, which is the World Grand Prix. I would much rather watch that film instead to see Lightning struggle against faster, more manoeuvrable cars. It's effectively an extended Mater's Tall Tale, and that in and of itself would have been fine, but as an official Pixar released film, this is just an incredible disappointment. Mater overstays his welcome, and it makes the film unwatchable at points. I have a lot of nostalgia for this movie, since I watched it religiously growing up. I loved it, because at the time, it was my favourite movie, but going back to revisit it, every time I wind up less and less satisfied by the film upon rewatch. It's needless to say that my nostalgia has outgrew this film, which drops it to the very bottom of my ranking list. The only thing Cars 2 has going for it is some incredible animation with an outstanding attention to detail, but that comes as standard whenever we're talking about Pixar. Luckily the film is also pretty fast paced with some creative action sequences. Mater and McQueen also have a great bond, which is fun to watch unfold before you, and it's nice to see your own friendships reflected through them, though I do think the messaging of the film is lost in its execution. It's telling you to be yourself, but sometimes being over the top can be offensive in certain cultures, and the film shames anyone for thinking that telling someone to be sensitive in a certain situation is in the wrong. At the very least, the film feels as though it's over quickly due to the fast pace that I mentioned earlier, and getting to hear Michael Caine's voice as Finn McMissile, that's a pretty cool touch as well. But moving along to number 26, we move from well-intended but ultimately awful storytelling to forgettable and average storytelling with The Good Dinosaur. For good in the title pretty much sums up the film's quality, as it's simply good, nothing better, nothing worse. If you couldn't remember a single scene in this movie, I couldn't blame you. It's a generic boy and his pet type story. Arlo, and yes, I did need to research the main character's name, is much too flawed to begin with, and his growth is a slow burn, making you lose interest in the plot very quickly as you desire to see where the next scene takes you becomes smaller and smaller. Arlo and Spot's relationship does create a unique dynamic, however, with Spot, the human, being treated like a pet in this instance. It's a nice twist on this sort of story, even if it's used to tell the same story we've seen done time and time again. I will admit that the film does have some hard-hitting emotional beats, and that's what you remember from this film, not for character stuff or even for stuff leading up to the moments, but instead of the emotional moments themselves. In even a film as generic and forgettable as this one, Pixar are still able to bring their emotional storytelling and incredible animation. It's what makes mid-tier Pixar a highlight compared to other studios. If this was an Illumination film, for example, then it would be at number 3 on the list, or number 2 at best. But as for number 25, on the other hand, I have a film where Pixar did a favour for Disney and animated one of their princess fairy tale stories. This film is a lot more stylised than other Pixar films, and its unique brand of humour helps the film to stand out. I love how the bears don't talk, since you're not annoyed by animals that shouldn't be able to speaking for 90 minutes straight. The body language adds to the comedic value and tells the story in a non-patronising way, as the film trusts its audience to understand the values of the story through body language alone. Like always, the film looks gorgeous and the voice acting actually brings a lot to the emotion and comedy of this film. It's a great cultural study, as you truly feel as though you're braving the Scottish mountains. The growth relationship between Merida and her mother-in-laws is compelling, and you could find yourself relating to either argument, as neither party is really in the right nor the wrong, and the film does a great job executing upon that concept. The deeper themes aren't the only things that keep the parents engaged, however. There is also the older skewing comedy, which is again what makes this more of the black sheep of the Pixar catalogue. But unfortunately, everything about this film is just so incredibly average. The villain has an intimidating design and a nice resolution at the end, but this is still one of Pixar's weaker villains, as I can't even remember his name, and it's a villain shoehorned into a story that doesn't really need a villain. The conflict between Merida and her mother is enough conflict to keep you engaged without the need for a direct antagonistic force. If Brave could exceed more at one specific thing, I could see it doing better on this ranking list, but as it stands, it's getting number 25 when ranked amongst all of Pixar's other masterpieces, because it just simply doesn't have anything that strives quite as high as Pixar's other films. As for number 24, I have Finding Dory. Spoiler alert, but Finding Nemo ranked very well on this list, so you can imagine how disappointed I was in Finding Dory, a film which doesn't have the same sense of urgency and adventure as the first film. Setting the entire film in the Marine Life Institute rather than the entire Australian Ocean gives the film less opportunities for interesting visuals and settings, making this setting quite dull after a while. Nemo and Marlin are there out of necessity rather than actually adding anything to the plot. The side characters are very charming, however. Hank's arc keeps you engaged throughout, but the structure of the story is a bit messy, and how they actually traverse the area is completely unbelievable, and it really pulls you out of the film. The script could have done with a little refining, but just like The Good Dinosaur, what you remember from this film is the hard-hitting emotional moments. Dory reuniting with her parents will make even people with a black heart tear up a little, especially after Dory's told that they died, and that moment is portrayed with maturity and sensitivity. It's one hell of an emotional rollercoaster that lingers for anyone who's seen it. If not for that moment, this film wouldn't really be able to justify its existence, and it wouldn't have even done as well as number 24 on the ranking list. But number 23, on the other hand, is going to be yet another disappointing follow-up film for a franchise that should have just been left well enough alone. However, Monsters University is still a very good film in its own right. It expands upon the Monsters universe and gives us some really creative character designs. It also explores themes of identity and friendship which are deep and can be related to by many different audiences. The music for this film is really underrated, and it adds a lot to each scene to make the emotional impact of each one of that little bit more substantial. This film looks more into creating depthful characters with satisfying arcs than it does creating huge and upsetting emotional moments, but I like the style it uses to do so. Much like Brave in a vacuum, this film is more unique than other Pixar films. The character designs aren't only creative in how they look, but also how they function in the world around them. Each monster in the Uzma Camper team has a unique way of moving, which ultimately becomes their greatest strength when competing in the monster games. The final act of this film is very memorable, not only for the growth of its main characters, but also the fact that the duo don't get what they wanted in the end. They started at the bottom and had to work their way up, which is an incredible message to send to the audience. This film just lacks any particular oomph to make it better than any other Pixar films yet to come up on this ranking. As for number 22, I have Lightyear, a film which my laptop seems to be a lot more excited about than I am. That's if you can even hear the fans of it running like wild in the background, but regardless of whether or not you can hear my jet plane about to take off, when it comes to this film, it's meant to be an action sci-fi film made to feel like a live action film that young Andy in the Toy Story universe would love so much that he'd want the Buzz Lightyear toy in real life. At least in real life according to the Toy Story universe. The film is trying so hard to be that it fails to establish any sort of identity of its own, and that there is the problem. And that's topped off by the fact that I don't think Chris Evans is the most talented voice actor out there. I'd prefer Pixar to keep with their non-celebrity voice acting roots. Buzz is also a little robotic with his personality, or shall I say lack of personality, and he becomes unlikable, dare I say, at times. The beginning of the film feels rushed, and since you're not able to invest in these characters and care about them, what happens to them doesn't create that emotional impact the filmmakers hoped it would. I'm sure that's what the point was behind the structure of the story in the first place. After all, Buzz's life is flashing before him, and his obsession with completing the mission is making him blind to the way he's hurting the people who he loves. This leads to a compelling and unique character arc which does come to a satisfying end, but unfortunately this leads to the uneven pacing and annoying side characters really being highlighted due to the story's poor execution. It draws attention to the film's flaws over its strengths. This is not how you would fare well in a ranking video. The animation and action are stunning, but the film needed to do more with its characters to have any sort of lasting impact. The twist reveal is so uninspired and you cringe at the reveal because it adds nothing to the film, and it leaves you feeling cheated rather than amazed or shocked. The film is still pretty creative with its setting and its character designs though, so I will give it that. I think the mediocre box office is a reflection for the film's mediocre quality. As for number 21 on the other hand, I have yet another Pixar sequel in the form of Incredibles 2. Just like Cars 2, I have a lot of nostalgia for when this film first came out. I remember the hype and the build-up for this film. I also remember seeing it about 20 times in the cinema. The film is fast-paced and the action sequences, they give me goosebumps. The film also treats its audience with maturity. There is actual alcohol and bad language in this film. For once, Pixar isn't scared about presenting children of the world with such real day-to-day things. It doesn't pretend that such normal things don't exist like other animated films do in order to protect a child's innocence. Newsflash! No child lost any of their innocence watching this film because Elastigirl had a drink and Evelyn Dever said crap. Speaking of Evelyn Dever, this name can be rearranged into Evil Endeavour, a play on words which revealed the twist villain to audiences before the film had even came out. This makes the villain twist incredibly unsatisfying to watch unfold, though the moment Elastigirl figures it out does bring some tension, so there is some praise to be said for it in that respect. But Evelyn Dever, or the Screenslaver as she calls herself, has a plan which makes no sense. The motivations are also bare bones, and the foreshadowing is so heavy-handed it leaves nothing subtle about it. What's ultimately the main problem behind this film is that everything is so on the nose and over-explained. Evelyn has her villain monologue, something the first film mocked. This film does carry over the style of the first one though, and the family dynamic here is incredibly strong and really fun to watch. Setting the final climax on a boat did limit what they could do with it though. I much preferred the action sequence at the house, as the powers of these superheroes were used much more creatively in that space. This is yet another Pixar film which does not live up to its predecessor, and it suffers in this ranking as a result. Because even in a vacuum, without comparing it to its predecessor, it's still thinly plotted, too long, and lacking fulfillment upon its full potential. Kicking off the top 20 at number 20 is Luca. We've already moved into Pixar films I really like, and that goes to show how strong their catalogue truly is. Luca is what Pixar looks like when they play it safe, and what we get is still an 8 out of 10 film without a doubt. So that tells you a lot about a film studio when what they make is qualified as phoning it in, and yet that very same project is still stronger than most films of any other studio. Again, this would be number 2 in Illumination's ranking. As for the movie itself, the setting has character and energy. The colours really pop and create a more unique visual style when compared to other Pixar films, which is something I really admire. It does follow traditional story templates at times, such as the fish out of water cliche, but I like how the villain here is just your typical bully. It reflects life accurately because sometimes you do just come across those people who are selfish jerks and nothing more. Pixar knew exactly what this villain was and who he needed to be, and as such they didn't use any of the time of the film to give him any extra depth that just wasn't needed in the end. So instead we spend that time fleshing out the main characters and building up their dynamic, and that creates a nice charm for the film, which is incredibly fun to watch due to the on-screen chemistry of these friends and how their friendship with one another builds. The voice acting is also really good, and it brings distinguishing personalities of all of these characters to life, and you grow to care for these characters quite easily as their goals become your goals and your immersion is maintained throughout. Just like Monsters University though, the film has no real standout moments. It's a pleasant watch and the film's charm makes it a difficult one to hate, but since the film doesn't accomplish any high highs, I can't in good conscience put it higher in the ranking than other greater Pixar films. At number 19 is one of Pixar's underrated gems, and you're going to hear that a lot in this video because when you have a studio as prestigious as Pixar with so many phenomenal films, even ones which are still great in their own right get overshadowed, and Onward is one of those films. A fantasy setting taking place in the modern era is an interesting twist, though the modern era seems a little too like our regular real world. It would have been much more creative to see modern technology twisted to fit the fantasy setting much better. At the bare minimum, the magic sets this fantasy world apart, and it's presented in a visually interesting way. Spells being binded with emotions is a great way to push Ian's arc, which keeps you invested, but the glue binding this entire film together is Barley. His support for Ian is what makes this film stand out. It's a great dynamic to watch, and its growth feels organic. As everything for Brothers endure lead to an appropriate ending where Ian is finally able to make sacrifices that Barley has been making for Ian all along. The fact Barley never once gets jealous of Ian's magical abilities and does nothing but support him is what makes his character so compelling and likeable. Even if he doesn't have too much of a character arc to call his own, the film hits its emotional stride when Barley is finally able to say his goodbye to his dad, which he was never able to do before he died. What these characters say, and when they say it, makes sense as well for the structure of the story. Barley talking about being scared to say goodbye to his father is something that you would want to keep to yourself. At least I certainly would in that situation. Even with uneven pacing, this is a heartfelt story which takes a depthful look at brotherly dynamics and how older brothers can be selfless and influential, even if it takes some time and maturity for the younger brother to finally see it. Being an older brother myself, Barley is such a great character to me personally. The only thing holding this film back is the lack of difference in technology from our world compared to Onward's fantasy world. There could have been much more creativity there, and there is also hardly any character growth for anyone except Ian, and once again the film is lacking any high highs Pixar films are known for, with the exception of the ending, which hits you like an emotional dump truck. Like seriously, I was in tears, not even tears, I was in shambles at the end of this film because of how hard hitting the emotions truly are. As for our 18th placed film on the ranking, we have A Bug's Life. For one of Pixar's earliest films, it's outstanding how well the animation actually holds up still to this day. The film is very tightly written, with Hopper being an incredible villain, then Flick has this energy, charisma and resourcefulness to make him such a compelling main character, and it's coupled with charming side characters that all play off one another very, very well. The chemistry between these characters is contagious. The whole story is built on a simple misunderstanding, but the way it meanders and builds from this simple foundation is incredibly clever, and it's what makes the writing for this film so phenomenal. This is just a film where you quickly fall in love with the good guys and immediately understand to fear the villains, as Hopper is strong and intimidating. It's a shame he's absent for a large chunk of the film, but that's because this part of the film knows to build Hopper's threat rather than explore it. That anticipation is great for the pacing of the film, even if it does leave Hopper being a little more basic compared to other Pixar villains. But I love Flick's speech to Hopper at the end. It's really empowering, and you're left very satisfied by Hopper's downfall. The film uses fear, comedy, and empowerment to its advantage, and it uses music effectively to elevate those emotions, but without many contrasts and negative emotions, there is very little emotional impact in the end, and that makes this film feel less substantial than other Pixar films. It's a great film in its own right, but it doesn't stack up well when compared to the rest of the Pixar catalogue. But as for number 17 on the list, we have Turning Red. This will surprise you, but I've never been a teenage girl, so I've never exactly had the same emotions and scenarios inflict me as Mei Ling has. But even with that lack of relatability, this is still an incredible film that pushes boundaries for what films appropriate for children can handle. It tells children who are growing up and maturing not to be ashamed of who they are and what they're growing up to become, as the film balances this lesson of respecting your parents whilst also striving to become what it is you want to be, who you need to be. The friendship between Mei Ling and her close group of friends is incredibly compelling. Their chemistry with one another is energetic and so much fun to watch. This is such a tight-knit group of friends that it becomes Mei Ling's happy place, and they're all nothing but supportive for Mei Ling, and she wants to make sacrifices in order for them all to accomplish the goals they have in common. The structure of the story does become a little messy and disjointed, and the film is clearly meandering to a certain audience. That's not to say people outside of that audience won't enjoy the film. It'll be harder for them to identify with the themes being tackled, and that's about it really. The film is just oozing with so much visual and editorial style that it's easy to overlook its flaws. And its cultural appropriation is a fun thing to experience, as I don't really know anything about Mei Ling's culture, so getting to watch and learn about it is pretty cool, so it's something no longer exclusive to that culture, as now the whole world can get to enjoy it. For number 16, I have Pixar's newest film, Elemental. Pixar's newest film isn't quite within its top half, but it's still a piece of art that goes without saying, because the way the elements interact with one another and the way they interact with the world, it is creative and visually dazzling. Ember is an incredibly complex main character who's sophisticated with layers, and as her character grows, my investment in the film grows with it. I do wish there was more background and history to this world of elements. How this world came to be is barely explored, since all we get are a few visual shots within the first few seconds. Ember's relationship with Cade does feel a little forced at times. That's both for when they're getting close and when a wedge is being placed between them. This creates conflict that feels random and inconsistent, making it hard to gauge when we should be worried or when we should be happy for this couple. This softens the emotional impact as we're left to kind of guess how we should feel, and it makes their relationship less compelling over the course of the entire film, as we don't feel the need to remain invested in the state of the current relationship, as it feels like its status will just change again for the dozenth time in the next scene. I love what the film does with lighting, however. From a technical standpoint, it's Pixar's greatest film because its lighting is manipulated in such gorgeous and realistic ways. Sometimes I forget I'm even watching an animated film, though the cartoonish design is blended with such realism can feel a little silly and jarring at points, but this is something I felt only a handful of times, and it's still technically very impressive. The ending also goes for the generic fake-out death, which is obvious and predictable, leading to the emotional impact not being nearly as powerful as the filmmakers were hoping it would be. It's actually more emotional when Ember shows her father the bow of respect, as it's a source of guilt for him, so she's able to repair that hole in his life and demonstrate how important her family is to her. In fact, it's quite refreshing to have a younger protagonist so dedicated to her family's wishes exclusively, even at the expense of her own wishes, because it's the opposite of what other young protagonists are like throughout films, even throughout Pixar's other films like Coco. It all culminates in a satisfying but ultimately emotionally unimpactful ending, making it slot right in with mid-tier Pixar. Coming in at number 15 is Up, a film notorious for its first act, where you'll montage through Ellie and Cole's life together. For it to end so tragically after such a fulfilling and happy life they share creates such a strong juxtaposition of emotions, which lingers throughout the runtime of the rest of the film. Carl's regret and lust for adventure makes sense because of how powerful this montage is presented before us. The opening act is what the film is remembered by so fondly, but after such an impactful start, it's easy to forget that the rest of the film still has its moments too. Carl learning about how much of an adventure he gave to Ellie after looking through her photos and being reminded of the powerful life they've lived makes him feel the same way we as the audience felt at the start. It's a window in which we directly relate to his character, and now he's learnt that he actually fulfilled upon his goal the entire time. It's left room for the finale to neatly wrap up his character arc. The conclusion to this film is a little too action orientated where it didn't need to be, though this does make it very exciting, and it's comedic watching these two older men duke it out and having the problems you'd expect from older age. Russell and Doug do get a tad annoying, but that makes you relate with Carl's situation a little bit more, and they still have enough of an engaging dynamic to carry the majority of the film. Kevin has so much character and energy through his body language alone, making his inclusion into the group feel a lot more dynamic as a result. Up certainly is an entertaining film, which may drop off heavily after the first act, making it unevenly paced, but it's still memorable and creative to help it distinguish itself from other Pixar projects and act as a masterpiece in its own right. Moving along to number 14, halfway through the list we finally have our first Toy Story film. Given that all four of these films have fallen within the top half of this ranking should highlight just how truly exceptional all of these films are. The original Toy Story revolutionized animated films, presenting the world with the very first 3D computer animated feature film. Then 26 years later they gave us Toy Story 4. Even the weakest Toy Story film has very poignant moments and creative storytelling elements tackled with maturity. Woody has given everything he has to protect the child that plays with him, whether it's Andy or Bonnie. Whilst Toy Story 3 wrapped up Andy's story in the most satisfying manner possible, Toy Story 4 dares to ask the question about what comes next for Woody. Can he continue to give up everything for the child that he's currently with, even at the expense of his sense of self? I think it's odd that they chose to give Buzz such backwards development though. He's really dumbed down in this movie, whilst Duck and Bunny serve no purpose outside of comic relief. But at the bare minimum they fulfill upon that purpose as they deliver some of Pixar's funniest moments. The reverse twist villain with Gabby Gabby is refreshing and very memorable. This does make it hard to root for her so suddenly after being encouraged to fear her, but the way she's tossed aside is something no living being deserves to endure. The range of emotions you feel is what makes her climactic moment so poignant, since she gets to fulfill upon her goal, becoming the owner of a new child, but the child herself is given such courage through finding Gabby Gabby, and this turning point for her is so emotionally packed, it has me tearing just thinking about it. But the heart behind this film is the relationship between Bo Peep and Woody, whose dynamic is the best here that it has ever been, and if you thought the tears ended with Gabby Gabby, you could be more wrong, because the final goodbye between Woody and Buzz confirms how close they truly were, and they're sacrificing that bond so that Woody can finally be lost no longer. This is some bold storytelling which I admire. I do think the structure of the story itself is pretty messy. Stuff just happens that leads from one thing to another, and the other toys are so heavily sidelined to where their inclusion literally adds nothing to this film. Even Buzz has very little impact on the events of the story. It's disappointing that we wait 9 years to see these characters again, and they've all been delegated to nothing more than background noise. But we're not done with Toy Story just yet, because the second film is coming in at number 13 on the ranking list. Toy Story 2 does so many interesting and clever things to expand upon the first film. Buzz Lightyear's mission kicks the film into high gear since the very first frame, and it sets up for what's to come, whilst also being a clever little twist as it's a video game that was being played the entire time by none other than Rex. The film also tells a story about the things that all kids dread: the day our toys break. In this manner, every child can relate to Andy, but since we know Woody is alive, this tear will affect him as well, and it makes this rip all the more heartbreaking. Woody is then introduced to the rest of his roundup. All these characters have energy and charisma which plays off each other very, very well. But Woody's kidnapping leads to a handful of the other toys taking on a mission to save him, which is where our two plot lines come in, and it's at this point in the film where we are all just littered with satisfying scene after satisfying scene. This film really does spoil us on how many great scenes it displays on screen before us. But that being said, it's Al's Toy Barn which is the pinnacle of this entertainment value because it has some chaotic driving sequences, and the fight breaking out between the two Buzzes so that Buzz can finally see how delusional he was in the first film just always puts a smile on my face. Then there is also the famous scene where Woody is cleaned up. The most interesting character study in this film is the internal conflict within Woody between his loyalty to Andy and the promise of his new life with the rest of the Roundup gang. In the end, Woody being Woody, he chooses to be loved by a kid, and he makes that kid's life all the better simply because he is in it. Since both of these plots are equally interesting and engaging, it means that when we cut from one plotline to another, we're never left feeling at a loss, and I love Jesse's backstory. Toys outlast the love their owners have for them and often end up neglected, which is what gives Woody second thoughts about his life with Andy in the first place. A lot of scenes carry a lot of tension where you find yourself yelling at the screen, which is some excellent immersion into the film's world. It's also clever and resourceful how the toys use their surroundings, like driving the car to keep up with Al. Then in the airport, even after chasing the wrong case, they're able to use the flashlights to save Woody. This is because Stinky Pete is angry and bitter as he's never felt the love of a child, a very interesting direction to take this character and add to the unique aspect of him being a toy in the first place. No other character could feel this way because they don't come from that same context as Stinky Pete, that being that no other characters are toys. This film is just littered with so many nice character moments and creative action sequences that it pains me to put it at number 13. Alas, besides Jesse's backstory, there isn't too much emotionally tragic to make you tear up. The structure can get a little messy at times as the film lets too many ideas and plots run at once. It's also very on the nose with its Star Wars and Jurassic Park references, and the film doesn't really need those. It creates a dated feeling for the film. Toy Story 2 is simply just a film which I personally don't care for as much as I do the other Pixar films, and that is why it's ranked at number 13. But that leads us nicely onto our number 12 slot, which goes to Cars 3, my personal favourite non-Toy Story sequel of the entire Pixar catalogue. This is the Cars film, where Pixar really shone through the cracks. Unlike Cars 2, where Pixar's usual quality seemed to drain from existence entirely, the film represents what the second film should have been. The idea that McQueen is struggling to keep up with competitors for the first time in his racing career. I love the parallels this film draws to other sport films and real life athletes who simply can't keep up with the youngsters all too often. It makes you easily sympathise with Lightning McQueen, and you can't help but root for him. I will admit that the film is quite slow until the Demolition Derby, where the excitement really picks up and no scene after that point is wasted. The Derby acts as a means for Lightning to reaffirm his confidence in himself, as Smokey even points out how despite everything, Lightning doesn't even have a scratch on him. The training montage then acts as a homage to the Rocky films, which is pretty cool given that I like those films. During this montage, we get to see more and more of Cruz Ramirez's racing side. Cruz is what makes this such a great film, since she lacks confidence, which is really relatable, and her life isn't what it could have been because of it. Through the excellent voice acting, you truly feel that sense of loss, and it hurts seeing her in this light. Lightning grows to really understand Cruz over the course of the film, and he understands racing, so the twist where he takes up the booth and talks Cruz through her first race becomes predictable by the end of the second act, and when it actually happens, it's a tad annoying as it slows down the pace and brings your immersion out of the film due to how unbelievable the situation seems. But the heart of this film is the relationship between Lightning and Duck, a relationship absent in Cars 2 after Paul Newman's tragic passing. Seeing that dynamic return through the unused lines Newman recorded for the first film really sets up for some poignant moments. It's because of the impact that Duck left on Lightning that he decided to become that same mentor but for Cruz instead. I love the dynamic between Lightning and Cruz and how that builds throughout the course of the film. Cruz is also such a layered character, and her growth at the end really puts a smile on your face as it leaves the impact it's meant to because of the relatability you've felt with Cruz throughout this entire film. If the beginning wasn't so slow and the ending was better, then I have no doubt Cars 3 would fare even better on this ranking list. But enough of a Cars 3 rant already, as the sequel myself as a childhood fan of this franchise always dreamt of, so instead let's get back to talking about Pixar's original projects, starting with Soul at number 11 on the ranking list, a film which leaves itself to interpretation through its use of nuance, and it intends to leave the viewer with more questions than answers. This is because the film encourages you to go out and simply live life, find the answers which are personal to you. It's a powerful and memorable message told through creative metaphors and stunning animation, which reflects a culture not regularly seen through live action films, let alone animated films. This film truly did break new ground, which is what makes it such a masterpiece. Joe being allowed to live at the end is an ending which has people split, but I'm personally glad that he was able to return to his life so that he could finally live it after he's completed his character arc, leaving viewers on a more hopeful note where they remember the message rather than the rest of the film fading away in their minds due to all that's left in their head being the emotional ending. Up had a problem where the emotional highlights of the film became all that the film was known for afterward, so luckily Soul manages to avoid that flaw as it creates one of the most unique animated films out there. The ideas about life and death keep you invested and constantly reflecting upon your own life throughout. It's hard for the film to lose your interest in the end, if this bold storytelling is something I hope to see more of in Pixar's future. But as for number 10 on the ranking, WALL-E is going to be kicking off the top 10. This film builds so much atmosphere through its barren landscape, dull colour palette and eerie music. It's a mysterious setting which leaves us excited to see how the story unravels itself. WALL-E is such a lovable character, and his loneliness makes it easy for us to root for him. The way he cares for Eve when she shuts down and can't return that affection is cute and full of so much passion. To tell such a sophisticated story in such a unique world without dialogue is a testament to Pixar's strong storytelling skills. It also measures an audience capability to invest themselves emotionally into something that doesn't even come from our world. We're left tearing up over a fictional robot because we come to care for his character, and more importantly yet, the relationship this character has with others, because losing those relationships is ultimately much more upsetting than losing the character of WALL-E. It's heartbreaking and incredibly emotionally poignant, even if WALL-E is perfectly functional, to see him lose his memory. I do think everything on the Axiom starts to bring the pacing down a little, but WALL-E's good heart continues to inspire those around him in the most satisfying manner that doesn't feel contrived at all. It's all an organic growth within the character's dynamics of the film. It's also a great message to send to the audience that even when you don't belong because you're different, it doesn't mean you can't make an impact on those around you. The space sequences are beautiful, as the music adds to the emotional attachment you have with this robotic relationship between WALL-E and Eve, which is more human than most other relationships we see in other films. Seeing ourselves in WALL-E is another thing which makes this character so damn compelling. This is a worthy top 10 Pixar film, and it goes to show the strength of all of the other movies coming up on this list if a masterpiece such as WALL-E is still just going to come in at number 10. WALL-E was one of my childhood films, and I seem to keep changing my pronunciation of WALL-E every single time I say it, but regardless, when it comes to the number 9th ranking film on the list, we go from one of my childhood films to a film which defined my childhood. Cars is my childhood, a film with one of Pixar's strongest endings. I will be the first to admit, Lightning McQueen skewers far too much to the unlikable side for a grand majority of this film. His attitude and behaviour make him hard to root for, especially when the town of Radiator Springs and its inhabitants have such charm to it. But it does make McQueen's arc more noticeable when he proves Doc wrong and becomes selfless for the town he's come to love, and he's finally slowed down and taken in the beauty of his surroundings. This film is incredibly close to John Lasseter's heart, as it's based on a road trip he took with his family down Route 66, where they came across all sorts of quaint rural towns with colourful characters. That personal touch is seen in every single frame of this film. The film does have some very uneven pacing, as we spend a majority of it with McQueen as he fixes the road and builds in character. When you compare that to the speed and energy of the racing sequences, it's not nearly as entertaining. Really though, those are my only flaws with the film. Paul Newman brings such nuance to Doc's character through his phenomenal voice acting work. The score when Doc drifts through Willie's Butte is powerful and leaves you mesmerised through the animation and the sound alone. This all leads to one of Pixar's finest endings, because after McQueen's character growth, you're truly rooting for him now. Everything he's learned is incorporated into this final race where you see his friends so incredibly proud of him, which really does put a smile on your face. But anyone who's watched the film would know that McQueen sacrifices his victory so that he can help the king finish his last race. After the accident, he sees Duck in the king and chooses not to let his final race end like Doc's did. The reaction to McQueen's selfless display of sportsmanship brings a tear to my eye every time, because it's not just the act itself but how everyone else around him reacts to this act. It's, as I was alluding to earlier, a means of which to prove Doc wrong about Lightning when he calls him out for not caring about anything other than himself. I love this movie on a personal scale so much, and nostalgia does play a part in this film's placement within the top 10, but even with all that personal bias aside, I still do think this is one of Pixar's strongest films, but I still can't put it alongside the next 8 masterpieces to come. What's important to note about these top 8 films is that they're all so incredibly close together in quality, and my love for them is so immense that they're practically all number 1. I could see any argument for any one of these masterpieces being anyone's favourite Pixar film. These 8 pieces of art are undeniably some of the best films ever produced, let alone some of the best animated films out there. So let's start things off with the original Toy Story. Pixar's first film is still one of their best. This film is very clever, firstly with its broad appeal, because just about every child has toys, which begs the question, what do the toys do when no one is around to see them? That is the question that this film tackles, giving it a unique selling point, and by making the story about these toys that come to life when no one is watching is a concept incredibly creative, which also encourages children to be imaginative. But this is merely a concept. Luckily, Toy Story uses this fundamental idea to build an interesting narrative based around these toys, and this crafts a unique narrative where the story wouldn't work if these characters weren't toys. Really, the only problem with this film is just how much of a bully Woody is at the beginning. Luckily, he is given a healthy dosage of character development, which makes you care for him more and you want to see him achieve his goals. Buzz Lightyear is an incredibly interesting character as he thinks he's a real space ranger, and you need for him to break out of this illusion, as he's been putting himself and Woody at risk. But when he does realise he is nothing but a toy, his reaction is truly heartbreaking, which is elevated once again by some incredible music. Sid is also an interesting character, in that we get subtle clues as to why he abuses his toys, probably due to what seems like an absent and alcoholic father, and Sid doesn't know that the toys are alive, so blowing them up and taking them apart doesn't bother him, as he thinks he's not hurting anyone in the process. Obviously, because we're rooting for the toys here and we know what Sid does to the toys, we don't want to see the toys hurt, and we want to see Sid's plans foiled, but it doesn't change the fact that he's more of a sympathetic character. The final truck sequence is full with creative ideas, and it's clever how Woody uses everything he's learned through the course of the film to glide back to Andy in the end, where the poor kid's heart is finally full thanks to Woody and Buzz. It's not only the growth of these individual characters which is captivating, but also how their friendship with one another grows. This is a film which executes upon its clever premise perfectly. The animation certainly isn't as good as Pixar's recent work, but for 1995 it holds up very well. Moving along to number 7, we have Coco. Pixar's other films like Turning Red and Soul allow us to explore cultures outside of our own, and Coco is no different. The story revolves around Dias de los Muertos, the Mexican festival known as Day of the Dead. With this exploration of Mexican culture, it's now something accessible for the entire world to enjoy. The development of this film is an interesting one, as the entire story got redrafted when Pixar employees visited Mexico for Dias de los Muertos and learned that their original script about Miguel letting go of his dead mother went directly against the true meaning of the festival, which is to remember and honour the dead. The colours and production design of the film draw attention upon the Mexican culture and give the film a nice visual style, even with a realistic approach which can seem similar to other Pixar films. Every frame just has so many contrasting colours, it looks like an artistic painting at sometimes, then others it will look like a complete reflection of reality. I think this film could have done with more cartoonish art styles at times. Luckily, the atmosphere and colours are contrasted heavily between the world of the living and the world of the dead, giving an intriguing look into a world other than our own for us to invest into and enjoy. The film's music is also incredible, which is pretty ironic given that the main family of the film has a hatred of music, which is why the original script also changed from a full-blown musical to a film with just a handful of songs. The atmosphere, the emotion is all heightened by the music, but what keeps you coming back to this film is its characters. Miguel starts off selfish as any child would be, and that relatability really helps you resonate with Miguel and you want to see his character grow. Through the actions of Hector, Miguel learns about the love and support his family was showing him all along, leading to a legendary finale which is incredibly fun to watch with or before you. The twist with Ernesto being an absolute jerk could have been seen coming from a mile away, but the extent of Ernesto's evil couldn't be foreseen as easily. Ernesto literally murders his best friend for his songs, which is a much further step than he possibly could have seen coming, so the villain getting what he deserves in the end is very satisfying. Pixar animated skeletons is interesting from a visual standpoint, making the way that they move unique and full of energy, especially with Hector's movements. It's another great contrast to World of the Living, where the emotional heart of this film is found. Miguel reuniting with his parents and then singing for Coco, giving her a chance to remember and speak with her family for one last time, is something that's really powerful and emotionally poignant. It's through his actions that the family dynamic grows and becomes more inclusive, which is a great way to wrap a neat little bow around the entire narrative. For number 6 we have Inside Out, a concept which certainly is a little strange at first glance. This is a film revolving around emotions in and of themselves, and at first glance I thought the concept of this movie was dull and uninteresting, but boy was 13-year-old me stupid. Turns out this film has depth and layers to it that most other films can't even begin to tap into, let alone other animated films. It's really creative how Pixar have visualized the mind, and the explanation of everything within it is certainly very exposition heavy at first, but they still favour visual storytelling as they show rather than tell more often than not. Pairing joy and sadness as such contrasting emotions together is a great way to build a fascinating dynamic, and Riley's struggles are easy to resonate with as they're familiar to a vast majority of audiences, but you can also see the reaction of her emotions themselves and truly understand her mindset. Visualizing every element of her mind is very creative, and all of these elements interact with one another in an intricate way to build up this fascinating world. The film is at its peak of its creativity when Joy uses all of these aspects in culmination with one another that we've seen independently explored through this world up until now, and as soon as they come together, they help her complete her task in getting back to headquarters. It's also incredibly clever how every action in the mind has a real life consequence for Riley. This is how Joy grows through the course of the film. Amy Fowler gives Joy such contagious energy, and it's a blast watching her personality unfold on screen before you. Joy's single and only goal throughout the whole film is to keep Riley happy and keep her away from emotional pain, but she learns for the sake of Riley's best interests that no one single emotion can control a human life. It's the combination of all emotions that make life what it is. It's hard to get the emotional support you need when you're unable to show it. Being able to communicate your sadness is key to improving the situation, which is what Joy discovers firsthand, and it's why she directly goes against her initial goals to keep Riley away from emotional pain as she learns about the necessity of sadness. The culmination of this character arc for Joy and how it improves her friendship with sadness helps leave a heartwarming emotional stamp which lingers on you long after the credits roll. A film about emotions is unsurprisingly emotional, Bing Bong also makes the ultimate sacrifice, as Riley needs joy more than she needs the memory of her imaginary friend. Anyone who doesn't cry at Bing Bong's sacrifice has a heart of stone. But we're finally kicking off the top 5 with Monsters Inc. at that number 5 slot. I've already talked about the unique designs for the monsters and the unique ways in which these creatures interact with the world around them. It's just as clever in this film as it was for Monsters University, but Monsters Inc. shines brighter as the much superior film because of its storytelling, and more importantly, because of its characters. Randall is the obvious villain, who you come to fear throughout the entire runtime. His colours and reptilian nature are inherently villainous, as is his voice, but most importantly, his actions. With him acting as a primary villain, it's all the more surprising when you learn of Waternoose's betrayal of Sully. This really takes you off guard as a memorable twist, and the conversation between Waternoose and Randall confirms that Waternoose still has the utmost respect for Sully. Their relationship throughout the entire film has been like a mentor and a mentee, which is what makes Waternoose's betrayal even more surprising. But Waternoose still upholding that respect and not liking what it was he was forced to do is what gives his character additional depth. The factory itself is also a really clever setting, though I do wish more of the film was set in the surrounding Monstropolis, because this is a unique world with unique inhabitants that can offer more escapism and creativity than just your typical warehouse setting. But at least the concept of monsters going through doors into the human world to generate screams to power their city is a concept of pure genius, and you're left captivated and inspired by the creativity and exploration of this concept. The door sequence in particular is very creative and incredibly fun to watch. It's no wonder that this scene has become so iconic, but the most compelling elements of the film easily come from the 3 main protagonists and their relationship with one another. Sully is a scarer with a heart of gold who grows close to this human that he decides to name Boo. He sees how much of a monster he truly is when he terrifies someone he loves in the scare room, and his inner conflict adds additional layers to his character which keep you invested in his character arc. Then his relationship with Mike is full with energy and charm. They play off each other perfectly and it's incredibly fun to watch. The voice actors really do add a lot to this dynamic, as these voice actors feel like they've been best mates for years now. Their friendship also grows through the course of the film, so just like Sully's character arc, it keeps you engaged throughout. You can't underestimate Boo's love for Sully, however. Her seeing him as Kitty is incredibly cute. It's nice to see her feel a sense of empowerment by scaring all those bigger monsters simply through her presence. Even after she's terrified by Sully, she sees him rescuing her and realizes that the monster isn't really who he identifies as. She then outgrows her fear for Randall when it comes to protecting Sully, just like how Sully protected her. Monsters Inc. is simply a film rifling with creativity poured into every single frame of animation, and characters that leave you with a rollercoaster of emotions as their dynamics grow and develop. It's a very memorable film with sequences that have become iconic for the entirety of cinema, not just the world of animated movies. But as for number 4, on the other hand, we have Finding Nemo, that rare cross-generational film where no matter how old you are, you can find some sort of enjoyment. Parents and adults can relate to Marlin's journey as he literally crosses the entire Australian Ocean and risks his life to reunite with his son. Nemo, meanwhile, bonds with a strange new set of characters and is forced to put himself into situations that scare him, but for the better of his group, he must go through with these scenarios, and it leads to children being able to relate to Nemo as he has his annoyance with his overprotective father and the need to prove himself, whilst the adults relate to Marlin's desperation and determination, putting Nemo first before anything else, especially after his traumatic past where he has a promise to keep to his only surviving child. Only Pixar could make an animated film where a barracuda shows up and kills hundreds of babies along with their mother. This opening is traumatic and incredibly emotional, setting the stage for Marlin's emotional character journey, which keeps you invested from beginning to end. You are hooked. This film grabs you and never lets you go. It's a fast-paced movie due to just how fun and entertaining it can be, but you're also fearful as these characters are constantly in danger. It is clear from the start the stakes behind this movie, and you care for these characters so you don't want to see them harmed. It leads to some fantastic emotional payoffs towards the end of the film, which is a fantastic culmination of everything our characters learn of their respective journeys. Marlin learns to trust in his son and let him go, as Nemo has become braver and more knowledgeable on escape and danger. This film also proves how important friendship can be, because neither of these characters could accomplish their goals without the friends they met along the way. The entire film is all the more thrilling by the fact that there is urgency. Nemo has to be saved before Darla shows up, and that inevitable looming threat is what keeps you engaged within the plot. As we watch Nemo struggle to escape in time, really the only problem with this film is that the two plots seem a little too disjointed from one another. Yes, both characters are working towards the same goal, reuniting with one another, but the events that occur in one plot don't directly impact the other until much later in the film. Even then, it's only the story of Marlin's journey that inspires Nemo's bravery. That's the only impact Marlin's journey has on Nemo's sequence of events. And then Nemo's sequence of events don't impact Marlin in the slightest, because Marlin doesn't know. He's completely unknowledgeable of Nemo's current precarious situation. It's a shame that plot B cannot affect plot A and vice versa. It's obvious the plots had to be executed in this manner, given that the characters are separated, so what one character does cannot physically change the course of another character, so this flaw is more of a nitpick than anything else. But the fact that I have to resort to nitpicking to find flaws in this film is proof of just how good it actually is. The film also gets a little cliche at times, such as Marlin misunderstanding the situation and therefore becoming disheartened by it. Misunderstandings happen far too frequently to further the plots in films. I just love how, as I've grown up with this movie and as my outlook on life has changed through the years, as too has my outlook on this film. That proves just how cross-generational the appeal behind this film is, and it's fantastic to watch a movie like this and have these different perspectives upon it. Its writing is phenomenal, its characters are phenomenal, its creativity is phenomenal, and as you'd expect from Pixar, the animation is also breathtaking, and it easily holds up 20 years later. But as for our top 3, we now get to look into Pixar's almost flawless masterpiece collection, starting with Ratatouille. Any single one of these films could have been number 1, but for me, I just so happen to like The Incredibles and Toy Story 3 that little tad bit more. But staying on task with Ratatouille, the idea and subsequent execution of that idea are brilliant. A rat which can cook and communicate with a human so that the pair can become the best chefs in France is such a creative concept. A rat and a human are such an unlikely pairing, but you quickly learn to care for their friendship and their dynamic, as it's energetic and incredibly expressive in terms of the body language used. The film then becomes memorable, as it's a joy to watch this friendship develop. Their equal cockiness gets in the way of their friendship, proving just how alike they actually are, but all of that doesn't matter in the end, where Remy puts his life on the line quite literally, and it's not only for his dream, but it's for his friend, and Linguini takes notice. I also love how this film takes place in France. It's a great way for Pixar to explore this culture and present it for the entire world to enjoy. Ratatouille has so many layers to it due to the complexity of its themes and its writing, too many layers to digest at this point in time. This film shows how passionate the filmmakers at Pixar are at bringing these animated masterpieces to life. They pulled out all of the stops for this film, and children, whilst not understanding the deeper meaning of each of these layers, can still enjoy it because of the physical comedy and the friendship Linguini and Remy share with one another. Plus, the film is fast-paced in nature. Just like Finding Nemo, it's a great cross-generational film that all audiences can appreciate. But number 2 for me is The Incredibles, a superhero film which came out years before superhero films dominated the box office, but this superhero film continues to stand out in the sea of superhero films still being made to this day because of the central family dynamic within this plot. It's a little dated with the gender stereotype roles, like the father being the breadwinner and the mother being the stay-at-home wife. But this leads to either plot constantly impacting the other, as the actions of one character directly impacts the other. It's a great way to continue to put emphasis on this family dynamic whilst they're still physically apart from one another. The cross-cutting in the editing just really highlights the bond this family has as a unit. Family truly is the most important thing, and when Bob loses sight of that, it leads him to grow more substantially as a character. The film also has elements of espionage films, as Mr. and Mrs. Incredible sneak around Syndrome's island. In typical spy film fashion, the film is only as good as the villain, and fortunately for The Incredibles, Syndrome is one of Pixar's finest villains. In a physical matchup, Syndrome is no match for Mr. Incredible, so he uses his intellect instead. Syndrome is a villain born from Mr. Incredible's mistakes, making the dynamic very personal and fun to watch. Throwaway lines of dialogue like he just starts monologuing is used as plot relevance later on to reward viewers for keeping that information stored at the back of their minds. The film even played into Syndrome's cape when he was defeated, something which Edna had previously warned Mr. Incredible about, so that was a really great way to wrap a neat little bow around that kind of circular storytelling in a way. Syndrome's motivated by the idea of a world where no one can be super, as when everyone is super, no one can be seen as special or above anyone else because they're all on the same playing field, for a lack of a better way of putting it. It could be considered a noble idea if not for Syndrome's insanity and pure evil, as he executes his plan with absolute mass murder of an entire group of people. This film gets pretty dark at times, so throughout the film you're left to admire how much Pixar is getting away with for a film designed to be watched by children. That naturally makes you more entertained by the film and you want to watch it because you won't get the same experience by watching something else. The Incredibles is a film I grew up with and it still holds up to this day. My nostalgia doesn't need to carry this film as it's great on its own merits. But obviously this means my favourite Pixar film is Toy Story 3. In fact, this is one of my all-time favourite movies, and my second favourite animated film of all time, right behind How to Train Your Dragon 2. When they split up the characters, I don't like how the events of one plot barely impact the other until the characters reunite. Woody finding out about Sunnyside through Chuckles is ridiculously lucky, making the coincidence feel absurd as it pulls you out of the movie instantly. But I like how Lotso is revealed as the villain of the film before this twist within the story. You know already what Chuckles is talking about, so you invest entirely into the backstory without needing to process the twist as we learn why Lotso became as evil as he is, because we know he's evil already, we just want to figure out why, how that came to be. And this leads to the film being split between two plots, where either plot is engaging and fun to watch, so you never feel at a loss when cutting from one plot to another. It keeps the pacing of the film constantly moving forward, and it leads to Pixar's best third act of any film. Sunnyside, being like a prison, is a great metaphorical look at the power of bitterness and jealousy, how those negative emotions can twist a character and cause them to create hierarchy type culture where those at the top benefit at the expense of those at the bottom. This prison break sequence at the end of the film is excellent, as it's creative in its execution and it builds up tension that maintains your excitement throughout the entire sequence. That pace and momentum is never lost as we make our way into the memorable dump sequence. It's memorable because of its emotionally scarring nature. For a moment, you truly think these toys are going to be burned alive, and as they embrace themselves together, you just can't help yourself but tear up. I'm not crying, you're crying. And it's such a heart-wrenching moment. But then, suddenly, you get to feel the relief of them being saved in the end, and boy, is that feeling of calm really felt throughout your entire being. Like Woody, as his sigh of relief, it's just so incredible to watch. It really creates a film that you don't simply just watch, this is a film you experience. Lotso is such an evil character which juxtaposes his warm and cuddly aesthetic and his soft voice. It's what leads to a twist being so jarring and memorable when it's finally revealed that he's the villain behind the tyranny of Sunnyside. This is a film which speaks to me on a personal level. I always feel such a broad spectrum of emotions when rewatching this film, and it's a film I like even more every single time I rewatch it. It's for all these reasons that Toy Story 3 is without a doubt my favourite Pixar film. I cannot, in good conscience, end off this video without first thanking all of my incredible channel members whose continued support help make these videos possible. Without them, these videos would be near impossible to make, so from the bottom of my heart, I truly appreciate every last one of them. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more, there are plenty of options on screen now to explore, and please consider subscribing to keep up to date with all my content. On that note, this video is coming to an end, so thank you so much as always for watching. Until the next video arises, peace!